as said, if you get this question, both of these are basically the same thing. Outline and evaluate research into the effects of institutionalisation is the same question as outline and evaluate Romanian orphan studies, and they're both the same questions that say discuss research into the effects of institutionalisation, etc., etc. So if you get either of these, then your AO1, as we've noted, is going to be the research into Romanian studies themselves. So to deal with that AO1 then, how is it best to approach it? The easiest and most manageable way is to get one study, one key study, and detail that in enough information for 6 marks. Now it doesn't have to be Rutter et al. You could use Sienna et al. But Rutter et al. Has a lot of information in it, so it's going to be easy to pick up the 6 mark with just that one study. And because we're looking at outline evaluating research, then that means we can deal with the aims, hypotheses, variables, sample, procedure, findings, conclusions. There's absolutely masses to say, as we can see here. Now, if you lay out your revision on studies like this, with each section dealt with wherever possible, then you'll find it much easier to pick up those marks. As well as the aims, the procedure and so on, and the findings, we also want the conclusions, of course. That's going to be very important for when we come to do the AO3. As that's what we're going to be saying, can it be trusted, can it not be trusted about. So now you've got the table of results and the conclusions here as well. I'd advise you to stop this now and have a good read through of this information, have a look at the level of fine detail. You don't need to remember it all, but you should know some of the fine detail from each section, and absolutely definitely you should know this final information here, along with the fact that just under half of the Romanian children who were disinhibited here actually got better. Okay, so 54% remained in the disinhibited attachment style, but the other children improved, so 46% became more securely attached. I think given the amount of information you can see on the previous slide, and the limited time you have in the exam, it's perfectly reasonable to ask, well, how can I get all of that into a couple of paragraphs very, very quickly? The first thing you have to realise is that you shouldn't talk about all of it. You should select the most specific and most pertinent information. There is more than 6 marks worth on that previous image, on that previous slide. But the other thing you need to realise is the bits you have selected you need to know inside out, so you can literally just get them to the page from your brain via the pen as quickly as possible. An example is about to follow. Again, I suggest you maybe pause the video at that point if you need longer to read it. So if you look through this, you'll see the kind of things that are picking up marks. Rutter et al. 2011 took a significant natural experiment into whether the effects of institutionalisation could be reversed, so we've got the aim in there. The sample was 165 Romanian orphans adopted before 6 months, or between 6 months to 4 years of age. They also studied a control group of 52 British children adopted before the age of 2. The adoptees were raised in loving families and were tested on physical, social and cognitive development. Do get the tested in there as well. At ages 4, 6, 11 and 15, with qualitative data being sought from parents and teachers. They found that Romanian children were more physically and cognitively underdeveloped than the control group, and a greater percentage showed marked disinhibited attachment at age 6 than in the control group. 26.1% of the Romanian orphans adopted after 6 months, compared to 3.8% in the control group. They also found some variation in effect, that's another significant finding, with only 8.9% of the Romanian children adopted before 6 months showing the same disinhibited attachment. And it's also worth noticing that the percentages for both groups were lower at age 11. Consequently, Rutter et al. Concluded the impact of long-term emotional deprivation is not as severe as Balbi predicted in his maternal deprivation hypothesis. That is, it can be reversed. Of course, Balbi thought it couldn't be. So, if the deprivation is caught early, the effect can be fully reversed, but the longer a child is in an institution, the less easy such reversal becomes. You can see we've got absolutely masses in there to pick up those marks, even though it's only just over 200 words. Having dealt with the AO1, this then brings us back on to the AO3, the analysis and evaluation. And when you're doing analysis and evaluation where your AO1 is the study itself, that means we can have methodological points, so issues to do with the way in which the study is conducted. Can we trust it or not? And we can also obviously look at conflicting or supporting findings. Right, so they're the kind of things we are looking out for. Now, what is interesting with this question, if you're looking at the research as your AO1, two of the analysis and evaluation points that we used in an essay for the effects of institutionalisation can be used just as well here. So our first point is going to be research report from Ziana et al. Again, we're using this as AO3, so we only need the findings and conclusions. There should be absolutely no mention of the procedure because that is AO1 on a study rather than AO3 on a study, so it shouldn't be in here. It actually brings down your mark for selection. So just focus on the findings, learn a couple of those to support the idea that yes, you can see really negative effects such as disinhibited attachment coming out from children who have been institutionalised. So you can see this is quite a straightforward point to make and probably one of the most obvious ones you could come up with. Then our second point is also one which were used in the other essay, and that is we cannot necessarily generalise the results from Rutter et al.'s and Ziana et al.'s studies actually, because the effects of institutionalisation seen may not be solely down to emotional deprivation. There are confounding variables. And this is where you would go again into the tremendous neglect and physical and cognitive deprivation that these children suffered from because of the sheer overcrowding of numbers in these orphanages in Romania, which meant that the staff simply weren't able to give them the level of care, even basic care, never mind being able to form an attachment with them. So these children were left for all day with maybe just 15 minutes of interaction, just left in a crib with nothing to do, no stimulation, they weren't learning language. There's an awful lot going on here. We can't say it is just down to the lack of an emotional bond that the effects we see from these studies are occurring. Now, a new point for this essay, although you could in fact use it in the other essay as a third point there if you wanted to, is that this point, number 2, might not be as bad as it seems, because Hodges and Tizard did a study in 1984 and then revisited it in 1989, and their findings about emotional deprivation and the difficulties that children have overcoming that are pretty much completely in line with Ziana et al. And Rutter et al. So, Hodges and Tizard found that adopted children could quite often form attachment bonds with their loving adoptive parents, although some still did remain insecure, I think avoidant, whereas they couldn't necessarily form quite as effective relationships with siblings and peers, where these children were not quite as adept at helping the adoptee bridge the gap between themselves as the adoptive parents were. So actually a tremendous amount of mirroring in these research findings, and the thing is of course that Hodges and Tizard were in the UK. That's where they were doing their research. What this means is that this concern about the confounding variables may be the thing that's causing these negative effects of institutionalisation rather than the lack of emotional care. That doesn't seem to be the case, because in the UK we know for a fact, we had well documented records, these children had been looked after physically, their needs had been met physically, they had got cognitive stimulation, mental stimulation. All they lacked was actually a close connection with an adult who cared for them, because there were up to 50 care workers sometimes coming in and out of those homes with the high turnover that meant the children just couldn't manage to attach securely to anyone. And so that does seem to be the root of the effects. And for our fourth point, we're actually going to go back to a very similar point to the one in the other essay about the effects of institutionalisation, whereas with there we were talking about now we know what these effects are, we can apply that knowledge to real life and improve it. In this case, we just tweak a little bit and say this research is really good because it's allowed us to find out things that we can apply in real life, which means we can help vulnerable children by making those changes, by bringing in key workers for each child so there is someone they can attach to so we don't get bond disruption, by ensuring that children are given up for adoption as quickly as possible from the birth mother rather than them being breastfed by the birth mother and attachment bond growing and then being disrupted at a later stage. So all those things about helping vulnerable children become relevant again. This time we're just saying, and isn't it fantastic that these studies have allowed us to do that? And then obviously you will conclude saying whether or not you thought the studies were good or were not good. Final thing here, of course you don't have to use any of these points, there are other points available. You pick the ones, remember, that you are happy with, the ones that you can explain well. And absolutely vitally, remember that you should only have 3.